Okay, so again, my name is Katie Reid. I'm the Advocacy and Outreach Coordinator here at the South Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. I think that most people who attend our webinars are familiar with SCCADVASA, but just in case you're new to SCCADVASA, our mission is to end domestic violence and sexual assault in South Carolina by influencing public policy, advocating for social change, and building the capacity of member programs, allied organizations, and communities across the state. So please visit www.scadvasa.org for more information about the work we do on a state level and about our partners doing direct service in every corner of the state. I'm pleased this morning to be sort of co-facilitating and hosting the webinar, Intersections of Human Trafficking with Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence, along with Marie Sazehn, who I will introduce in just 1 minute. Before we get started, officially just wanted to review our objectives. If the slide hopefully will advance, there we go. I'm not going to read the objectives. You guys can read these ourselves or yourselves, but just I just want to point out that this is a very short webinar. All our webinars are only an hour long, so we really can't cover everything that is out there in this huge topic, which is human trafficking. This is our first webinar on human trafficking, and so really this is just a start to the conversation. And hopefully after this we can continue that conversation here at SCCADVASA, but also that you'll go back to your agencies and organizations and continue this discussion. And we hope that you'll gain some tools really that you can use, some concrete tools that you can use in the future to start those conversations. I also just wanted to mention that we in South Carolina, I think are really, and I think Marie will talk more about this, but we're really right alongside most other states with this issue. We're seeing this problem grow in South Carolina, and we really want to be thinking as a state and as our own individual organizations about how we fit into this puzzle, and then act accordingly to ensure that victims of human trafficking are getting holistic, trauma-informed care in a systematic way. And so we hope that this will be the start of many conversations to come about how we all, not just we at SCCADVASA, but how everyone here that's on this webinar and all the different players across the state can fit into that puzzle. So before we get started, we would just like to take a poll so we know who you guys are. And so I'm going to launch a poll. Hopefully this will work. And you should see, we want to know who is here today. And unfortunately the poll only lets us post about 5 things. So if you don't see your organization listed, if you're not a Dbsa or dual provider, if you're not Department of Social Services, if you're not medical, law enforcement, or legal services, then if you'll notice to the right of your screen, you should have a chat box. And we would really love for you to type in what your organization is or what your role is. Who are you if you're not one of the poll members? So we'll just give you just a minute to just fill that out. Again, just clicking on the box that represents you and the work at your organization. And so far it looks like we've got, I don't know if you guys can see the percentage on your screen, but we can see that there's about 60% are service providers for sexual assault and domestic violence, or either individual or dual agency. About 4% is DSS, 12% medical, 20% law enforcement, 4% legal services, and we don't have anybody who typed in the chat box. So I assume that we have everyone represented, but again, if you're not represented in that poll, then just type in the chat box. And while we leave that poll open, just again, we're sort of getting familiar with our webinar features. I want to mention that the lines will be muted for the whole webinar, just to cut out distractions and chatter and things like that. But if you would like to ask a question, we will have times throughout the presentation where Maria and myself can answer questions. So the way that you can ask a question is to use that chat function. Again, you should see on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see like a toolbar for the webinar, and on the bottom is a chat function. And you can just type your message in here, and I'm just going to type, I'm just going to type hi So hopefully people can see that. And if anybody wants to type a question in or a greeting or anything like that, please feel free, and we will take those questions, write them down, and during the designated times, during designated times, then we will answer those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. It didn't change too much, so again, we have a lot of different diversity represented, and excited. It shows, I think, it demonstrates the diversity of people that are involved in this issue. So welcome to everyone. Before I hand it over to, I have one more slide before I hand it over to Marie. I just wanted to remind again, if you didn't hear me in the beginning, just reminding you that this webinar is recorded, and as well as any comments written in the chat box, they will also be archived. So this is not a confidential thing. Everyone can see what you put in the chat box, and those things will be archived. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows it's not confidential, and it will be recorded. Okay, so first of all, why are we talking about human trafficking? And I think I sort of presume, even though we have people on the webinar who are from a variety of fields, I think that most people who are attending our webinars are victim service providers, and maybe trained providers for victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. And so I want to talk a little bit about why are we talking about human trafficking today when we're coming from the standpoint of sexual assault and domestic violence. Well, the first thing is that victims of human trafficking are already showing up at Dbsa agencies. So if for nothing else, we're already seeing them. Last year, we estimated that more than approximately 30 clients at SCCADVASA's 23 member organizations were identified as victims of human trafficking. Now, when you take into consideration that in 2014, SCCADVASA member agencies provided community-based services, meaning non-shelter services, to 15,786 survivors of DV, and 5,513 survivors of SA received sexual assault services at the member-based programs, you might think that 30 is a low number. And so I guess you can say, yes, that is a low number, but we want to put that into perspective. First of all, human trafficking is difficult to identify. It's I always use the word leggy. It's a very leggy issue. And many of our member programs don't have the tools or the training in place for screening of DV. So most of those numbers, the 30 that we've sort of estimated, are coming from outside referrals. So they're coming usually from law enforcement, and many communities don't have law enforcement that also have the tools and the training yet. So we think that number is bigger. But so we think, this is really just the tip of an iceberg. We just don't know yet. But also, I hope everyone would agree with this, that even just one unserved victim is too many. So if we have the expertise and the systems in place, we don't even want to let one person go in our state. So number one reason is they're already here and we're already seeing them. The second thing is, and I think that this is really very important, is if you look at the needs or the experiences or the trauma of victims of human trafficking, they match very closely to the skills of victim service providers. So multiple forms of trauma that victims of human trafficking experience very, very complex trauma: post-traumatic stress disorder, sexual abuse, domestic violence, harassment. And the skills of victim service providers and advocates, they're really experts in trauma-informed care. And so y'all really have that background, that skill, and that knowledge to provide the most important holistic care that's trauma-informed. Second of all, victims of human trafficking need systematic and systemic resources. So they don't just need one thing, they need many things, and it can get very complex. And I think that most, really DV and SA advocates and victim service providers, y'all are really experienced at working within complex systems. You're working with, whether you're law enforcement and you're working with, the shelters, or you're working in a sexual assault agency and you're used to working with the medical system or law enforcement or judicial system. I mean, we're participating in SART teams and domestic violence coordinating councils or DV courts or family courts or whatever, and we're already sort of at the pulse of what's happening in a systematic response, and you have those systems in place. And certainly not lastly, but just lastly for today, the need for safety and security. Victims of human trafficking have very high safety needs and need to be safe and secure. And again, service providers in this field already have systems in place for confidentiality and for safety. So we really are in the right place to be providing the kinds of service that victims of human trafficking need. However, I don't want to minimize that this is a very complex problem, and advocates can't do it alone. There are some unique considerations we have to be aware of when working with victims of human trafficking. Safety needs, drug and alcohol addictions, issues with recruitment inside DV shelters. All of these things really have to be taken into consideration when working with these clients. We don't want to underestimate those considerations, and this is why we want to make sure that training and systems are in place. And Marie's going to talk about that more in this webinar. So all of this to say that just because there are challenges with working with this unique population does not negate the fact that victim service providers have a lot of experience in this field already, and they should be at the table to lend a hand with their experience when appropriate. So without hogging any more of Marie's time, I want to pass over the webinar to Marie Sazehn from the Attorney General's office. Marie is an Assistant Attorney General, and she is the Human Trafficking Program Coordinator. She has experience in working with lots of legal issues with violence against women. She's worked with legal aid and worked in North Carolina, and correct me if I'm wrong, Marie, North Carolina and South Carolina, and she is the one who is responsible for the South Carolina Human Trafficking Task Force. So we have a great expert with us today, and I will hand the phone over to Marie.
Hi, good morning everybody, and happy Friday. I'm very thankful to be part of this webinar, and I'm thankful Katie asked me to be a part of it. So I certainly hope to impart some useful information about human trafficking, and y'all certainly type any questions that you have along the way, because we will be keeping track of those and answering them down the road. So I do want to start off talking about generally what is human trafficking. What are we even talking about on a broad level? Human trafficking is often referred to as modern day slavery. If you watch any documentaries or you hear people talk about it on a grand scale, that's what they're very often going to call it, because that's what it is. It's modern day slavery. It's very basically when people profit from the control and exploitation of others. It's the buying and selling of human beings. It can be labor trafficking or sex trafficking, or it can be a combination of both. And I'll touch on what both of those are briefly here in just a little bit. But very simply put, and this isn't a legal definition, quite a legal definition, but very simply put, it's when an individual who is under force, fraud, or coercion is made to perform a commercial sex act, is it under involuntary servitude, forced labor, or is under debt bondage. Now, there is an exception in the South Carolina law for individuals under the age of 18 for sex trafficking, and I will get to that. But basically, we don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for sex trafficking for victims under the age of 18. And I will get to that more in just a second. But this is just kind of a broad overview of what human trafficking is. I do want to clarify some of the terms that you might hear in the human trafficking world, because there are some different terms that are thrown around, and I don't want it to get confusing. Somebody asked me to clarify these one time, and I thought it was a really great idea, so I kind of added this into my general presentations that I do. I really like it. Human trafficking, sex trafficking, the commercial sexual exploitation of children, sexual exploitation of children, and domestic minor sex trafficking, they're all kind of underneath the same umbrella of the big top word of human trafficking. So according to the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA, which you might have seen it kind of shortened as, that's a federal act. Youth who are trafficked into prostitution are victims of commercial sexual exploitation. A lot of time you'll hear the child advocacy centers or forensic centers refer to it as CSEC, or the commercial sexual exploitation of children. That is the exact same thing as child sex trafficking. The terms all mean the same thing. People just use different words. It all means child sex trafficking. Now, of course, you have the umbrella term of human trafficking, which can include trafficking of adults, children, foreign nationals, or of U.S. citizens. That's kind of our big word we're talking about here today. But that includes the domestic minor sex trafficking, which is sex trafficking of United States citizens, the child sex trafficking, which is sex trafficking of children from any origin, any nation, and then, of course, the CSEC, which is basically the same thing as child sex trafficking. So I hope that's clear, but I just don't want there to be any confusion about any of the terminology that y'all hear out there. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have about that. I do want to talk about some statistics and facts. There are not a whole lot of statistics in South Carolina right now about human trafficking, and it's because it's very hard to pick out and identify, but we're working on that. The task force is, but I can give y'all a few national statistics. It is a market-driven criminal industry. It's very high profits and low risk, which means that people are making a lot of money doing this, and it's not very dangerous to them, and they're not getting caught very frequently. So very generally, to traffickers, people are reusable commodities, and that sounds terrible, but to the criminally minded people, they really do see individuals as something they can sell over and over again. And I'm sure some of y'all have heard this comparison, but you have someone who sells drugs, and they go out and they sell whatever drugs they have, and then whenever they're done selling what they have, that supply, they're out. They don't have any more. But with a human being, they can resell that person over and over and over again. It's something that they don't have to go out and renew. Additionally, it's not as dangerous to deal in, human beings aren't. So if you have something that you're carrying around with you on your person that's worth thousands of dollars, you're very likely to get robbed or have a gun pointed to your head. But human beings also are safer to deal in to the criminally minded people. So like I said, that sounds terrible, but that's what we're seeing and that's what we're hearing. People are making a lot of money off of this, and they're finding out that it not only is it easier to deal in, but it's safer to deal in. Going to the numbers, like I said, they're difficult to pin down because of the extreme underground nature, but it is estimated that around 300,000 children are trafficked into the United States with an average age of 12 to 14 when they're pulled into the life. I've seen 12 to 14 for girls and 11 to 13 for boys, because girls and boys are both trafficked here. It's not just girls. If I ever do give examples and I say she a lot, it's just because I'm giving an example. Make no mistake about it, girls and boys are both trafficked. It's a market-driven criminal industry, like I said, so wherever there's a market for something, there's going to be a supply. NCMEC, which I'm sure a lot of y'all are very familiar with NCMEC, it's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They are very active in the child sex trafficking world, and they have a lot of really good information that we're going to give you their website and stuff later, but they state that 1 in 7 endangered runaways reported to them in 2013 were very likely to be sex trafficking victims. And I'll touch on that a little bit later, but the runaway population and children in the foster care system are very, very likely targets a lot of times for sex trafficking. And so NCMEC is very heavily involved in human trafficking world, anti-human trafficking efforts. It is a multi-billion-dollar business a year. I've seen $32 billion. That's the number I see the most. That's globally. It lags only behind drugs and arms trade. So it's right behind drugs and arms trade, and I am not surprised, and I wouldn't be surprised that it is catching up quickly, and if it would surpass it here in the next few years, because it is the fastest growing criminal industry in the world, due very large in part to everything I mentioned earlier because of the easy money, the reusable commodity, and it not being as dangerous.
Marie, let me just say one thing too that I didn't mention when I was talking about what we see in our member programs or what we have seen. I didn't mention that in that number, that 30 that we feel like have been identified last year, that included children, that included adults, it included boys and girls. So if someone's saying, well, it's only girls, or like you were saying, it is, we're seeing all of it here as well.
Good deal. Thanks, Katie. And some misconceptions I want to clear up really quick. I get asked a lot of questions, about it. So these are some things I like to just address up front. These are all not true statements. So traffickers and trafficking victims can't be related or married. They absolutely can. You might have a mother that's trafficking a daughter, a husband that's trafficking a wife. That's a very possible situation, and it's not a defense in court for a trafficker either to say they're related. So that can be a situation that you might see. It is not gender, age, or nationality based. I get a lot of people saying, so this is something that only happens to individuals that come over from other countries, right? And I'm like, no, absolutely not. It's happening to citizens, it's happening to foreign nationals, it's happening to individuals all over. So it's not based on any kind of stereotype or age or gender, anything like that. Trafficking victims do get paid by traffickers. You will very often hear, they didn't give me my money, I didn't make as much money as I was promised, he didn't pay me what he said he would. That is not something to be concerned about. Very often, trafficking victims will expect some kind of payment or form of money, or maybe that's why they even got sucked into it to begin with. But that is not something to be worried about, and it's not something that negates a trafficking situation at all. Victims are not always kept under lock and key. In human trafficking, very often you see the images of people that are kept behind bars. They have their hands duct taped, they have chains around their ankles, they have something around their mouth to keep them quiet. Sometimes that might be the case where people are actually physically restrained, but this is not always the case that they're physically restrained. A lot of times they could very often be mentally, psychologically restrained. They're not always physically kept where they are. So they often have freedom to move about, even though they might not feel mentally they can leave their situation, which is a parallel there between human trafficking and domestic violence, of course. Victims don't always recognize they can get and seek help. A lot of times traffickers will use severe control tactics to make victims feel that they are criminals themselves and make them feel bad about what they're doing. So they will not always self-recognize, self-identify themselves as victims or somebody that could even go out and ask for help, even if they need it. And then again, it does not require any kind of transportation across borders. You can have a victim that is trafficked over and over and over again in one location, and it is still trafficking. It does not require any kind of movement of the individual. Our statute does not require that at all. So that's not something to be concerned about either.
And I know for me, Maria, it was really interesting when I was learning this to hear about several of these pieces, but specifically the married piece, because I think for me, I've been working in the field of DV and SA for a while, and I think I just sort of would dismiss maybe in my mind if someone says they were married, like, oh, well then, you kind of start thinking, like I would start thinking in a certain way in terms of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, but would never have really thought about opening up my mind to really thinking about human trafficking. So I was really interested in that piece as well.
Moving on, so who are the traffickers? And I got this information from the Polaris project. We'll give you their website and stuff later on too. But nationwide, different kinds of traffickers that have been identified include all types of people. It's not an exactly specific list, and I won't read this whole list to you, but it does include men and women working alone or together. That's kind of one thing I want to hit on. It's not just men or like your kind of stereotypical pimp that I think a lot of people envision, or your mafia or gang member. It's men and women. Women are trafficking women, and a lot of times we hear about women kind of being the strong arm, the tough person, kind of doing a lot of the wrangling and a lot of the strong arm stuff in these situations. So it can be men or women that are doing the trafficking. It can be business owners, it can be gangs. Gang activity is getting involved in trafficking. Large factory owners, it can happen with brothel and fake massage parlor owners. So like I said, it's kind of very broad here as far as who is going to be involved in doing the trafficking itself. I do want to touch on the issue of demand here, because I am getting a lot of questions here lately concerning demand. And by demand, I mean who is buying, who is soliciting the sex, who are the Johns, so to speak. All ages. I watched a documentary about it, and it's really individuals from all ages, all professions. There is no stereotype. I think we kind of all picture this certain kind of person that's going to go out and buy commercial sex from a minor, and there really isn't any kind of stereotype that I've seen. This is overviewing the current laws. The current demand laws for adult solicitation goes up by offense. So it depends on how many times you've done it and gotten caught. It starts at up to 30 days or a fine, and it goes up to not less than 1 year in prison or a fine for the third and subsequent offense. And you can find that in South Carolina Code 1615-110. There are some sheriff's offices and police departments all over the state that do John busts, where they go out and they try to wrangle a bunch of these guys all up at one time. So there are efforts being made to catch these people that go out and create this demand that is creating the supply. So it is being addressed all over the state, but we know that it's an issue that needs to be looked into, and the task force is doing that. Minors, of course, carry way harsher penalties. If you go out and you solicit sex with a minor, it carries big consequences. I'm sure many of you know that. You have the criminal sexual conduct laws, criminal solicitation of a minor, sex offender registry automatically with a lot of these. So there's a lot of charges available here if you catch somebody trying to have sex with a minor. So I just wanted to touch on this very briefly and let y'all know that something the task force is looking at. We know it's an issue, but this is just some quick information about the demand side of things. All right, so where do you find human trafficking? We talked about who these people are, but where are they working at? So we're looking at prostitution or escort services, of course. I think that's one of the more obvious ones. Pornography, stripping, or exotic dancing. Sometimes you actually find it in the clubs. The internet is a really huge source of not only finding the girls, like putting these traffickers getting their hooks in the girls, but also advertising them, because you can put an ad on the internet and it goes to 1 billion people in about 10 seconds. So we're looking at Backpage, MySpace, Facebook, all kinds of stuff. You see people reaching out to these young girls on Facebook. You think Facebook's a benign medium. It's very interesting to see how many guys will message a girl on Facebook and say, I think you're really pretty. How about we be friends? And it's easy as that with these guys, meeting these girls on Facebook and MySpace. Of course, we have massage parlors. That's a really, really big one here in South Carolina that we're getting a lot of reports on. Going down the line, nail salons, any kind of agricultural farmland we're looking at for labor trafficking. Domestic care would be more like domestic servitude, any kind of situation like that. Restaurants, bars, cantinas, any kind of begging or peddling rings. Sometimes you hear about the door-to-door magazine sales crews where children might have to pop out and do that kind of work. So again, we're not really talking about specific instances here, but it's very broad, and you can kind of see where a lot of this stuff can be found and where you can find it in a lot of different places all over South Carolina.
Yeah, and just reiterating, like, just looking at this list, I see a lot, like, I know that a lot of our sexual assault agencies see a lot of people from, have a lot of clients from strip clubs or, exotic dancing, and it might just be simple questions of, how did they get into that, and what is it really, a choice, and, more detailed than we might, just not as simple as we might have think that it is. And then, just reiterating what Marie was saying about the massage parlors. We've heard a lot of massage parlors popping up, and, not to say that every massage parlor would be, but I think it's, a pretty good place to start, thinking about, not just as like an identifying factor of, is there trafficking in our community? And it could be a sign.
All right, I do want to talk a little bit about the human trafficking law. I'm not going to go too much into depth about this, but I'm happy to talk to anybody offline about this. I'm going to give y'all my contact information later. We did have an old human trafficking law. It did not have a lot of teeth, didn't have a lot of oomph behind it. So we had a new one passed in 2012. The General Assembly actually passed it unanimously, and it was effective at the end of 2012. If you want to look into it, it's South Carolina Code 16.3/2010 through 2090. I believe it's about to be extended through 2100. It's very long and comprehensive, but it's very interesting if you do want to take a look at that. The first little definition I want to touch on here, and this is not the actual word-for-word legal definition, I kind of paraphrased it, but of course is looking at what does our law define sex trafficking as. And very basically, it's when someone over the age of 18, someone over 18 or over that age is under force, fraud, or coercion is made to perform a commercial sex act or someone under the age of 18 performs a commercial sex act as facilitated by a third party and something of value is exchanged. So this is where the age of the victim is very, very important here. So if you have someone over the age of 18, we're looking for some kind of force, fraud, and coercion by a third party where they are made to perform a commercial sex act. However, if we're looking at a victim under the age of 18, then all we need to look for is something of value that was exchanged by a third party that facilitated any kind of sex act, basically that you can make an arrest for. Our sex trafficking law, the commercial sex act definition, is very, very, very broad and includes a lot of different sex acts. So one thing I do want to touch on briefly is what is something of value when it comes to the sex trafficking of minors. I had a conversation one time and the word money kept getting thrown around as something of value. Of course money is valuable. Like I want money, everybody wants money, right? So that's the easy one, but I believe that value can be very subjective when it comes to something like this. We can be looking at a mother who's hooked on meth who will sell her 10-year-old daughter for sex because someone is willing to give her meth for that. So if she's willing to do that, that's something valuable to her. It might not be valuable to me, it might not be valuable to you, but that's something that's valuable to that one mother that's willing to facilitate that commercial sex act with her daughter. So it could be something like, if you take me to the dentist, if you pay my rent, if you buy me food. It could even be something along the lines of when you're thinking about gang activity, if someone gets status in a gang, if they're involved in sex trafficking, that's something that we're considering here too. So is someone getting a higher status for the sex trafficking of minors? This is just something to think about whenever you're looking at these situations and the case-by-case basis of each individual that you talk to. And this last point here, I think some people kind of curl up when I make this point, but I do think it's very important to make this distinction here. What is the difference between a prostitute or a willing participant in the commercial sex trade, basically, and a victim of sex trafficking? So I would say the big difference here is the force, fraud, and coercion, and I'm only talking about individuals 18 and older here, okay? So if I know that the age of consent to sex is 16, but if you have someone 16 or 17 years old and they say that they are basically a prostitute on their own, then that is when you need to ask better questions and you need to find out what's really going on kind of below the surface there, because that's very, very young. So if you have someone over the age of 18 that says they are willingly doing it on their own, you need to look and see if there's any force, fraud, or coercion that is being instituted by a third party. And if there is, then they could very potentially be a victim of sex trafficking, and that's when you really need to dig into the situation and see what's going on there. So that's the big difference there, is are they under force, fraud, or coercion to be doing what they are doing?
And I think, I don't want to open a can of worms with this, but Marie and I, when we were setting up this morning, had a really interesting conversation. And I'm sure that many of you might have seen in the news, the Subway spokesman, Jared, has pled guilty to, I don't even remember the exact charges, child pornography, and he admitted to traveling across state lines and paying a 17-year-old to have sex. And at one point, I think there's two girls, I think one of them was 16. Anyway, you can look it up yourself, but I was saying to Marie, like, would that be considered sex trafficking? Because my husband and I had a really heated discussion, and, and my husband was saying no, because, if the girl, maybe the girls got paid, or if they wanted to, or what's the age of consent, and they weren't moved from place to place, and if we go back to the original definition, there doesn't necessarily need to be movement. And again, that question of, is there a third party involved with this, this child, essentially? And what is the something of value? Who was, was there someone forcing, fraud, and coercing these young women? And really, I feel like when you're looking at this broader definition, I think that there's some questions that could be asked. Now, prosecuting is a whole nother issue, but I think that we in the victim service field can be looking at, what is that something of value, and I really liked what Marie said about status. A lot of times, especially with young people in school, like, is that something of value? More often than not, really, there is that coercion that is involved, and it may not be financial. I think that's a really important point.
And I think a good approach, from what I've heard from law enforcement that very frequently work these cases, they say they go into a lot of these situations kind of assuming, especially if they do any kind of reverse operations, assuming that everyone they speak to, all the girls, are victims. And if it turns out that they're not, that they really are working on their own, then you know what, at least they approached it in a very appropriate manner. But what you're looking for is that force, fraud, coercion, a third party facilitating that. And if it's a minor, of course, you're looking for that third party facilitating it for something of value they're getting in return. So that's generally what I've heard about people that are working in the field with this. Labor trafficking, I do want to touch on this. People don't talk about this nearly as often. It's not in the news nearly as often. There are a good deal of federal cases in South Carolina that have dealt with labor trafficking. We do include it in our South Carolina law too, so it is definitely there for us to, to indict and prosecute if we want to, investigate, all that good stuff. So I do want to just talk about quickly the definitions of labor trafficking. Of course, debt bondage is where a person pledges their personal services or services of another person for security for a debt. This is where, I'll just give you an example. Maybe somebody comes over to the United States from another country. They pay to get here, but when they get here, a person says, okay, well, I got you a job, so since I got you a job, you owe me $1,000. And since you're working here, you're going to need transportation, so you're going to have to pay me every day for transportation. You're going to owe me rent. You're going to have to pay for food, you're going to need clothes, you're going to need all this kind of stuff, and you can kind of see how someone can get themselves in a real situation where they come here with nothing and they pile on this debt where they have to pay somebody for everything that they really need just to survive. So that's basically what debt bondage is, and when somebody gets themselves in a situation where they owe somebody supposedly an insurmountable amount of money that they have to keep working off and they never actually get to work it off. Forced labor is basically just labor or services performed by somebody under force, fraud, or coercion, somebody coerced by another. And so what we're looking at here is somebody working under force, fraud, or coercion. Involuntary servitude is the situation where you have someone that is actually in a position of servitude, like a nanny, like domestic servitude, something along those lines. I know we see the word coercion here, but basically we're just looking for force, fraud, or coercion here as well for any of these. And I do want to make it very clear, because I don't think I have sometimes in the past, we only have to show force, fraud, or coercion. It's one of the three, not all three. So it applies to labor trafficking as well. So these are just the three types of labor trafficking that are provided for in our South Carolina law. I don't think I've said these enough today, so I'm going to keep saying them. Force, fraud, and coercion. It's very, very important in our law because it's something that we do have to show in order to say this is in fact human trafficking for those over the age of 18 and sex trafficking and for all labor trafficking situations. So we want to definitely look and see in every situation, how is that victim forced, how are they defrauded, or how are they under some type of coercion. And so they're not defined in our law, force, fraud, and coercion or not. We're a little bit different from the federal law in that way, but I prefer it that way because I think you can look at each situation and really kind of see, what has this victim been through? What has this individual been through? And what can I show to prove that they were in fact a victim of trafficking? So of course I give you a couple examples here. Again, force, this isn't something that's always going to be present, the very obvious confinement or restraint. You're not always going to see people that are behind locked doors. But very often in sex trafficking, you will hear about beatings, rapes, and things like that in order to control individuals. Fraud is an example of the bait and switch type tactic where you have someone who says, I have a really good job available for you. They show up and it's a totally different situation than they thought. I'll give you an example of something I heard about one time. It was a girl who was on Facebook. She met a guy. He said, I think you're so pretty. Why don't you come over to California and I will make you a model. And she said, I've always wanted to be a model. So she got on a bus and went out to California. And I don't know how many of you actually think she got a modeling contract, but it was not true. She got herself in a really bad situation. So that would be an example of fraud. Coercion, I think here is the broadest one. It's going to be where you see a lot of threats to the victim or their family. Sometimes a trafficker will say, okay, yeah, well, I won't hurt you because I need you to go out and work, but if you don't come back, I'm going to go back and kill your mama. That's very powerful. Or you might even have someone say, okay, well, if you don't go do what I want you to do, I'm going to beat her and beat another girl that works for him. So you kind of have that guilt type thing going on. Debt bondage is, of course, coercion, psychological abuse. Here we see where you have a lot of the power and control tactics that you might often see in domestic violence type situations. We even have Stockholm syndrome type situations a lot in human trafficking, where the victim might bond with the trafficker to a certain extent. They might think they love the trafficker. That's my boyfriend. I wanted to do this for him. And so there's a lot of different situations here that we can look at for force, fraud, and coercion. Okay, I like to pop this model in here because it's what I think about when I first get a case run across my desk. This is the first thing that I go through in my head. It kind of breaks the law down as to, like, what do I need to meet in order for this to qualify as human trafficking. I got it from the Department of Homeland Security's website because I liked it. It's called the Action Means Purpose Model. We always need to think, do we have this in front of us for a trafficking case? So in our law, we have a whole bunch of acts that we can have that constitute trafficking. It's recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, soliciting, or attempting. You can look at the actual criminal section at 16.3.2020 if you want to see all the different acts. But do we have an act by the means of force, fraud, and coercion for the purpose of involuntary servitude, forced labor, debt bondage, or a commercial sex act as listed in the statute? Now, of course, again, here we have the exception for under the age of 18 for sex trafficking. And for that, we don't have to have force, fraud, and coercion. We just have to have something of value. But basically, this is just something quickly you can go over in your head saying, do I have an action? Do I have a means? And do I have a purpose? I just like this little model. It elementally breaks it down. It helps me out every time I got to look at a case real quick.
And we'll talk a little bit later about sort of screening and for victim service providers. And I think that this actually can be a tool to also help y'all in that area. We'll just touch on that in a bit later.
Okay, I do want to read this really quickly. This is very interesting to me. This is an excerpt from a book written by a trafficker. He was arrested and put in jail, and he thought, gee, instead of being rehabilitated, I think I'm going to write a manual on how to be a pimp. His book that he put out is called The Pimp Game. His name is Mickey Royal. I doubt that's his real name. And I did put this excerpt in here to show you how extremely predatory and terrible that these guys are, and how they think whenever they're looking for their next people that they're going to victimize. I'm going to go ahead and make a disclaimer here and say these are ugly words. I didn't put these words in here. I just used verbatim what he said because I really wanted to get the full effect in here. So I do know there's some foul language in here, and I apologize for that, but I do think it's important in order for everyone to get the full effect of what these guys are actually doing. And there are some things in here that sound like they're typos. They're not. He's not a poet. So I'm going to go ahead and just read this really quickly because I do think it's important in order to show what these guys are thinking. So this is from the chapter called Knocking, How to Make a Hoe. So she, the hoe, must want something, be it fame, stardom, love, money, respect, security. In order to be a hoe, she must want something. That something is that which she is willing to sacrifice all to have. That one thing, that need, is what she must attain before the hoe does. You then sell it to her for her soul. If a hoe wants fame, love, it doesn't matter. You make her believe you can and will give her these things. She must feel that the best and only way is the way you're going. A hoe is lost. Either she doesn't know where she wants to be, but she knows where she doesn't want to be. Again, not a poet. Or she does know where she wants to be, but doesn't know how to get there. So she chooses a pimp because he appears to know the directions. Maybe he does and maybe he doesn't. The hoe pays for the journey, not the destination. The pimp never has to deliver. It's his choice. It's always his choice. Remember, he never ever has to deliver. You take away everything she has, then give her what she needs. You, the pimp, are the cause as well as the solution to all of her problems. You give her the poison, then sell her the cure. When she has chosen you to deliver her dreams, you are in control. At this point, she is not yet knocked, or is she ready to be a hoe. She is not a hoe yet. The best and fastest way to get the hoe to choose you and relinquish her soul is to break the bitch down. Once this has happened, she is knocked and completely under your spell. By breaking her down, you leave her no other choice but you. Alright, so I know that's terrible, but I think it's a very interesting look into the way these guys think.
And of course, this is Katie again, just pointing out for those of us in the sexual assault and domestic violence field, I think we can look at this and see so much similarities to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, especially if you're thinking about the power and control wheel, and you can just see some of those dynamics right there and those control tactics. At this point, I also want to just point out, I think you should be able to see this, but if you can't, someone please type in the chat box. But if you look in your toolbar on the right hand side, you should have a tab for handouts, and you'll notice there are 4 handouts there. One of those handouts is the PowerPoint from today. Another handout is the Human Trafficking Power and Control Wheel, which if you click on that, you'll also find a tool called Biederman's Chart of Coercion, which Marie, you can actually probably say more about, but if you want to download those handouts, you can really look at using those tools and comparing it to this summary and really, again, pull out those where the power and control is used, just like we would with a traditional DV or SA survivor or victim.
Yeah, it's all about power and control. And the Biederman's control chart or whatever it is, it's like a diagram. It's really, really interesting because it's also often used in torture models, apparently across the world, as far as how you get to break people down. So it's very interesting to see how controlling and terrible traffickers can be when it comes to controlling their victims. So moving on to the next part, just briefly, human trafficking survivors. So human trafficking survivors do have special needs whenever it comes to whenever they're out of a situation. So why are the needs of human trafficking survivors different than those of domestic violence and sexual assault? A lot of times human trafficking survivors do need extensive long-term and wraparound services, and this can be because a lot of times a human trafficking survivor can be in their situation for a very, very long time. A lot of survivors either have PTSD or CPTSD, and so these can require a lot of extensive services once they come out of the immediate care and immediate safety services that you give them from the start. They can be involved in criminal networks, so sometimes you might be looking at more than one trafficker, more than one defendant, more than one person that's actually been abusing and trafficking this individual, so that can be a concern here too. Sometimes an individual might be recruiting themselves. There have been instances where an individual gets into a shelter or gets into a place and they're not the most honest person, and so they actually start recruiting from the shelters themselves. I mentioned earlier that women can often be traffickers, so you might have a situation like that. That's something to be wary of in these types of situations with human trafficking. Also, trauma is pretty specific, not specific, but it's very interesting when it comes to human trafficking. I've been able to sit through some special sessions on trauma as is specific to human trafficking. And some of the things to think about here are just that a lot of times with sex trafficking, these girls go to hotels, right? So that's something necessarily you don't want to take them to whenever you take them out of a bad situation. If you take them to a hotel and that's where they've been working for the past 5 years, that might be a bad trigger for them, right? Again, white sheets. All hotels have white sheets. You never know. I've heard of shelters before out of state. They don't use any white sheets because hotels all have white sheets. Could be triggers. A lot of times they ask the men that come into their shelters, like law enforcement or others that might come in, please don't wear cologne. Not only do the traffickers often wear cologne, so do all the Johns that show up to work, to have sex with these women. So please don't wear cologne whenever you come in. So there's a lot of specific trauma to sex trafficking to consider here, and there's a lot to learn about that whenever it comes to human trafficking survivors specifically. I really like this chart. On the previous page is the website where I got it from, but these are just some of the specific needs of human trafficking victims as it applies to adults, minors, and domestic minors specifically. So you can just kind of see here, and I won't read them out, but the different things that individuals might need. Translation, medical care, substance abuse treatment is very, very common because traffickers will often use drugs to control their victims. That's very, very common. Transportation, life skills. You never know how long someone's going to actually have been in the life with these people, so they might need all kinds of stuff whenever they come out. Child care, any kind of housing. So you can kind of see here yourself what some of the needs of human trafficking victims are.
And I don't want to spend too much time on this because I do know we're running short on time, but I do want to just say, again, for traditional Dbsa service providers, agencies, law enforcement, whatever, so this can get really overwhelming because the needs of human trafficking victims are in some ways so similar, again, to what we're used to seeing, but can get really leggy. And there are safety considerations that we need to be aware of, the recruitment issues that Marie talked about, and other issues as well, much more in-depth, perhaps, very just in-depth drug and alcohol issues and things like that. And so what we're saying is, when you're going back to your organizations and your agencies and you're thinking about how do we serve victims of human trafficking, you want to think about what you can do and what you can't do. Something like perhaps changing the color of the sheets that you use in a shelter might be a lot easier than some of the other things. So we'll talk more about this, but we're not trying to say you can change everything to fit the needs of human trafficking survivors, and that's why collaboration is key. Who is doing the things that you can't do? But so thinking about what can you do and what little changes can you make that would be appropriate, and what do you need to refer out for these other issues and needs.
These are just some resources, and I won't read through them. These are going to be available to you. Lutheran Services Carolinas works exclusively with foreign national survivors, but of course SCCADVASA, Sazehn, I'm sure y'all are familiar with them. Polaris Project, I've mentioned many times today. They're just a plethora of information about human trafficking, as well as the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, which is run through Polaris. We are going to be providing this, the whole webinar with all this.
It'll be for, you mean we'll give Polaris the webinar?
No, all this information will be available.
Yeah, it will be.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's on their slides.
Good. All right. So y'all have all this information. Department of Homeland Security, of course. NCMEC, I mentioned earlier, really good resource. FBI, of course, that's their number, that's their website. Their initiative is called the Innocence Loss Initiative. And then the South Carolina Attorney General's office, that website is where we have all our information. Then y'all also have my contact information.
I want to just again say something really quick about Polaris and the National Human Trafficking Task Force or Human Trafficking Resource Center. They have local numbers and websites for all states, including South Carolina, and I know some of you might have your agencies up on there. I will just say, just as a self-disclosure, SCCADVASA is not up there yet, partly just because and I think this is something everyone needs to think about before they get up there, is you're going to get calls. You're going to get calls from law enforcement if you're up on there, and you need to be ready for that. So just making sure that you can contact them. There is a process for getting your contact information up there as like a resource, but be prepared that you will get phone calls and you will get law enforcement. So and you will they do vet you. They don't just put you up there. But I just want to make sure that that is you will get phone calls, and you need to be prepared for those before you get up on there. Thanks.
I won't talk too much about the task force. I do want to mention that there is one. It was mandated in the law that was passed in 2012. We did release a South Carolina state plan. It's attached to the handouts that y'all have. It's a 58-page plan. It details at the beginning some stuff about human trafficking, just background. What is it? What does our law say? What does the federal law say? And the second half of it is kind of the attack plan that the task force initially said. This is how we're going to move forward in our state looking at human trafficking, and this is how we think we should address it. The second little executive summary there is an 8-page executive summary. They're both available on the Attorney General's website.
And Marie, the larger plan is also on the handouts. That again is on the right-hand side under handouts. So you can just click on that and get it quite easily.
Yep, good deal. All right. These are the areas we focused on that are in the state plan, and so you can find more information about these in the state plan. I do want to talk about some of the needs and challenges that the task force has recognized as we've been meeting. We have noticed that shelter space is an issue, but this is an issue all over the country. There is not one single state that I think can say we have adequate shelter space for all of our human trafficking survivors. I've gone to conferences, I've talked to people from other states. Everyone's struggling with this, but we know that it's something that we need to look into, especially for minors, looking and seeing what's going on there with that. So that's something that we're looking at in the task force. Training, and of course advanced training across the board for many professions. I love that people are doing webinars. SCCADVASA is doing a webinar like this. There's been training across the state. And so this is something that we're really trying to push out the task forces and to get done and to get rolling, to get people more educated about this and to make them aware. Of course, runaways in the foster care system is something that we know we need to address, because runaways and children in the foster care can be a really big target for human traffickers. Whenever there's a runaway on the street, they see that individual on the street and they think it's easy prey, basically, to put it quite simply. Identification of human trafficking. A lot of times it can parade around as prostitution, or it can parade around as something that looks completely different, and we just need to learn how to identify it from the start. And then of course we're working on getting a resource directory together so that we can have that accessible to people that are looking for human trafficking resources. It's just taking a while to identify individuals that feel comfortable enough to say we're ready to take on survivors of human trafficking full time. We have that available, so go ahead and put us on the directory, but we're working on that. Like I said, many groups are working on advancing all this, but it's going to take time. We're basically building the ship as we're sailing it. I heard somebody say that, and it's very true, but we're doing a very good job. Like I said, I've gone to conferences all over the country, and states are working on this just like we are, and we're about on par with all other states. And so we're doing a good job, in my opinion. And I continue everyone else to jump on board and help us with it too. The more the merrier. So. Okay. I want to touch on statewide and local task forces really, really quickly. We do have the statewide task force, which is really good for networking on a larger level, talking about statewide problems and all that good kind of stuff. But I really encourage local task forces, because it helps you know who to call in your area or close by when you have a situation. You have people that are familiar with human trafficking and the dynamics. Helps you to build resources locally, build responses that you need for survivors depending on the need. And then local task forces can help build structure when there's a situation that needs to be addressed quickly. So you have the statewide task force that has things on a large level, and local task forces can address things more on a boots on the ground. We're actually working with survivors and getting them what they need type level. And so I really encourage local task forces to form.
We're actually going to skip over the poll just out of time's sake, and I know we're just close to kind of being towards the end. We didn't get any questions in the text box. I assume the text box was working, but we actually didn't get any questions, so we're going to skip over the questions. And I just want to just going back through the task force really quickly is just again mention that many of you guys are on different teams, whether it's an MDT or a SARD or a DV coordinating council. Maybe thinking about you're already collaborating, so how can you use some of your time to talk about human trafficking in those meetings that you're already doing? You don't necessarily need to change everything that you're doing. I hope that if you can go away with one big thing is that we're not saying reinvent the wheel. Be creative and maybe tweak or expand a little bit. Don't redo everything that you're doing. That's not appropriate and at all not what we're saying. But we're saying you're already doing stuff and it fits in very nicely. So then just kind of ending really, really quickly on, and again, I'm not going to go over all of this just because of time's sake, but the hope is that once you're participating in local task forces and collaborating with service providers in the community, you'll have more information about where to refer victims of human trafficking when they're identified. And so then identification and screening needs to be done. And again, you need to have those conversations within your agencies, within your organizations about how do you screen, how do you use the processes that you're already using and just incorporate maybe one or two questions or expand one or two questions. Because victims of human trafficking will very rarely just come out and say it. And as always, just be mindful to establish trust. So you can read these slides on your own about looking below the surface, what to listen for, signs of being held against their will, or evidence of drug and alcohol abuse. As always, issues of safety. And then, and then asking questions. Questions related to mobility at work or home, access to money, where does he or she sleep, do they have a work contract? All of these might open up further questions. And let me just say that SCADVASA is working on a manual for our member programs. Those are our 23 Dbsa and dual agencies across the state, to help you guys use, think about identification and screening for human trafficking victims, and also having definitions and resources. So that is something we're working on and hope to have coming out in the next few months. So again, unless you have any questions, Marie, that you had burning, the only thing I wanted to just say is not a question, but just a clarification. When I was talking about the Jared case, the spokesman from Subway, I don't think I said this, but just to be clear, he's not from our state. He did not come into our state, so that's not an issue our state has to deal with, just something interesting to spark conversation. So I just wanted to be clear about that.
Very interesting.
Again, just a reminder, on the right-hand side, you have handouts to take out with you. If you click on the handouts toolbar, there should be 4 handouts there. The state plan, a copy of the PowerPoint from today, the human trafficking wheel, and Biederman's chart of coercion, and then also an identification tool. That's just a sample from the Vera Institute. It's really long. I'm not saying you need to use it, but it's just something interesting to think about, and to help kind of, maybe guide you in your discussions in your organizations about what questions to ask and how to phrase them. So, Marie, did you have any last thing to say, or?
I don't. I appreciate you having me here and doing this, and this is great. And y'all feel free to contact me. I believe my contact information was on the initial slide with my name on it. I'm happy to answer any questions, about the law or anything like that. If anybody wants to be a part of the task force, please contact me. The more professionals I can get on there, the better. The more people I can talk to about this, what you're seeing, what you're running into, the more that I can learn from you, and what's going on all over our state. So that's it.
And just reiterating again what Marie said, thank you again on behalf of SCADVASA. We hope you enjoyed the webinar today. Please visit our website, www.scadvasa.org. For more information about our organization, and also for information about our next webinar. The next webinar will be Friday, September 18th from 10 to 11 a.m. on underlying conditions for sexual and intimate partner violence. So we wish you guys a happy Friday, and we will sign off here. Thanks so much.